Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to the 1920s. Please take notes. This will be your first interactive notebook entry on this topic, and you will need these notes moving forward. Let's see if I can. We'll just leave the jazz on in the background. Okay, so one of the first things to know about the world of the 1920s is that it's a period of a lot of movement for Americans. There's a huge influx of refugees to the United States of America following World War I. If you remember back to one of our previous video lectures, we looked at the changing sort of nature of European immigration and the increase in immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. In the mid-1920s, as a way to sort of decrease the number of immigrants, Congress actually passed a series of laws, the Emergency Quota Act and the National Origins Act, which limited immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, again, kind of bringing the balance back to Western Europe, and as well as opening opportunities for immigration from other places closer to home. Asian immigration, thinking all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, continued during this period. But we do see influxes of Mexican and Canadian immigrants to the United States at this time. Many migrants, just like their forebears, settled in cities. And we also see the development of some suburban areas in the United States for the first time, places where people are living outside of the downtown urban area and using new technologies such as the streetcar, the L system in Chicago, as well as other opportunities such as cars to commute to downtown working areas. So along with that movement of people throughout the United States, we start seeing a split during the 1920s between the urban and the rural. For the first time in the 1920s, most Americans, meaning the majority of the population, lived in cities rather than in the countryside. This has to do with a couple things. First of all, market prices for farm goods dropped pretty dramatically after the war was over. After the push for people to create food, to be able to feed our troops overseas, there was a surplus afterwards, which means that prices went down. In addition, Americans were starting to farm kind of at a more industrial level, and operational costs, the amount that you would have to spend for some of the large farming technologies, such as big combine machines or tractors, those costs were rising after the war was over. We also see a boom in the industrial economy, kind of a second moment maybe of the industry that had helped make the Gilded Age so exciting if you were a business owner, continues in the 1920s, and we see massive industrial and commercial production. We also see change in, this filters down to change in the education system as well. Public high school attendance in the decades after the First World War doubles. So instead of going from grade school to working in a trade or working in farm production, more and more teenagers start going on to continue their education in high schools. Part of this has to do with the fact that there's simply more education needed for industrial work. You may not need a lot of job skills to be able to work an unskilled line, assembly line job, but if you are going into engineering or production or marketing or advertising or any of those services that kind of spring up, you might need some additional skills. Along with the shift, this sort of split between the urban and the rural, we see a change in American values. A lot of this becomes sort of centered on women in particular, and this is not necessarily like lightning bolt changes to American society. A lot of these shifts have to do with accelerating social changes that started during the Gilded Age. But, for example, women's suffrage was achieved during World War I in 1919. The 19th Amendment is passed, and women are allowed to vote for the first time in this country. And the women's movement embraces this new independence, but doesn't necessarily have the support of the entire nation. Many women were themselves against the suffrage movement and were then disturbed by what they saw as a lack of morals in the younger generation of women who were coming of age in the 1920s. Of course, we have the image of the flapper during the 20s. Young woman who was challenging traditional morals, wearing hemlines where, oh my goodness, you can see her ankles. It's actually interesting if you look at the amount of fabric that was used in dresses in the late 18th sorry, late 20th century, um, going into, or late 19th century going into the 20th century, the amount of fabric that it would take to create one dress for a woman just shrinks dramatically. Flappers are wearing clothes that are much more clingy, much shorter hemline, shorter sleeves, not nearly as conservative as maybe their mothers or grandmothers had worn. There's also a major increase in the percentage of women who are in the workforce. It's still not anything approaching the number of men who are working, but we do start to see women working in sort of clerking type roles, as nurses, as teachers, not typically in industrial production, but moving in that direction. The alliance of women who had come together to pass the 19th Amendment, or force Congress to pass the 19th Amendment, also kind of suffers its own internal crisis in the years following World War I, and splits into a more radical group and a more conservative group, who then fail to be able to come together and pass additional laws to protect women. So one of the culture in the 1920s is a great way of looking at sort of changes in American values during this time. The song I was playing at the beginning of this, which I will play again, is a great example of, it's actually one of the first jazz songs ever. The term jazz comes from a Chicago newspaper, the Chicago Daily Tribune, in 1915, so actually before the 1920s, to describe a new form of music that was more syncopated, that was more free of the conventions of a sort of musical line, where improvisation was really encouraged. And by the 1920s, this style of music had taken on across America. This song in particular that you're listening to right now is called the Livery Stable Blues. It's a song from 1917 and is actually considered by historians to be the first jazz song. This kind of music is sort of an affront to older values as well. If you think back to the songs that we listened to in class supporting the Spanish-American War, for example, the syncopation and improvisation of jazz were very free and very suggestive to older, more traditional audiences, many of whom were still those rural audiences. So a lot of the shift that we see between sort of new culture and new freedoms of the 1920s and a more conservative backlash against those has to do with this urban-rural split. Another instance that really exemplifies that split is Prohibition. The temperance movement had been around in America for years, and we've talked about it multiple times in this class up until this moment. But finally, in 1920, the 18th Amendment takes effect in January. The goals of the amendment are to eliminate drunkenness and the resulting abuse of family members. So this is in some ways tied to the women's movement as well. Get rid of saloons, which is another word for bars, which were seen as sort of hot houses of illicit behavior, from everything from gambling to fights to other sort of illicit behaviors, and also to prevent absenteeism and accidents on the job. Alcohol was such a part of American culture that it would not be strange in the early or late 19 teens for men to be having a drink before they went to work, or maybe a drink on the job. And a lot of that, particularly working with industrial equipment and sort of new technologies, made it so that people got hurt on the job more easily. If you're a business owner, that means that you are potentially losing time, you're losing money, having to either find another employee who can cover a shift or potentially replace damaged equipment. So the law that helped enforce the 18th Amendment, which by the way did not make drinking alcohol illegal, it just made the production or sale of alcohol illegal in the United States. So if you found it somehow on your own, you could still drink it under the law. But the Volstead Act was the law that was passed to try to enforce this. And again, exemplifying this urban-rural split of the 1920s, about 95% of people in Kansas, for example, obeyed this law, while only 5% of people in New York, which would of course include New York City, were following this law. Under the 18th Amendment, speakeasies, a secret sort of bar or saloon or club where alcohol would be served, where you could speak easy, flourished, particularly in urban areas during this period. Let's talk about aviation. So the first of man operated flight in the United States or anywhere in the world was undertaken by the Wright brothers in North Carolina in 1903. And by World War I, planes were being used by the military. This is an image of one of the dogfights, sort of aerial battles that really exemplify combat in World War I. But then in May of 1927, there's a huge feat, not just for aviation, but for the American people in general, building on what we read about in class today, where Charles Lindbergh becomes the first human to achieve transatlantic flight, which means crossing the Atlantic Ocean. You can see where he started on Long Island in New York City and flew all the way to France, crossing about 36,000 miles of open water by himself in a plane called the Spirit of St. Louis. This is a huge deal in 1927, which is towards the end of this decade that we are just now beginning to study. If you think about the tensions that have been created during this period and the sort of social conflict of the 1920s, which we'll spend more time talking about in class, Lindbergh is really seen as sort of a unifying force in America at this moment. His flight had come off of a week of terrible and devastating news from around the globe, including two French pilots who had also attempted this, who lost their plane somewhere over the Atlantic, school bombings in Michigan, a mine explosion in Virginia that had killed several people, Marines in Nicaragua, following up on the American sort of policy of gunboat diplomacy and dollar diplomacy in Latin America, had been killed in Nicaragua. Mississippi River was flooding and causing destruction in the central part of the state or central part of the country, and a woman and her lover were convicted during the same week for the very grisly murder of the woman, Ruth Snyder's husband. So this was a triumph in many ways, not just for technological innovation and sort of America being at the forefront of amazing technology, but also for bringing a country that was feeling like it was splitting apart and suffering back together for at least a brief moment of time. We will continue to look at many more of these social conflicts and tensions during the 1920s in class this week. But this PowerPoint and this lecture should serve as your guide for giving you some background about this decade.